Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Transfigured. I'm here with Will Barlow today. Will is a fellow Biblical Unitarian who has a strangely similar story to mine in some ways, but also different. And we've met a couple times. We've met at the Unitarian Christian Alliance Conference in October. And then there was another theological retreat in March. So we've seen each other a couple times. And the first thing that I want to talk about, you could give yourself a brief introduction. We'll get into your story later. But you are planting a new church in Louisville, Kentucky. And that's very exciting. And that's what we'll want to talk about first. So could you give us a brief introduction and tell us more about that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm Will, and I've lived in Louisville, Kentucky for the last little over 7 years with my wife. And we have 2 young kids and a third on the way. So I've got a son who's 5.5 and a daughter who's just over 3. And for the last 7 years or so, I've worked as in the actuarial field for a large insurance company here in Louisville. So I sit at a desk and crunch numbers and play around in Excel and do a little bit of computer programming, but nothing major.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So, yeah, even our day jobs are pretty similar. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. And when's your baby due?
Our baby is due actually right around the time our first church plant monthly services. So our baby's due. Yeah, our baby's due late August, early September, and our first monthly meeting is in mid-September, September 18th. So.
Well, congratulations. I don't know if you know,
Thank
but
you.
I have a baby due June 24th.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So and it's our third child as well.
Well, there you go.
So, and just podcast listeners, that means that I might not have as many episodes in, say, the month of July as usual, but just as a fair warning. So you're starting a church and you're starting your service, or did you say weekly service or monthly service?
Monthly services. So yeah, one of the unique things about church plants is everyone's new. You know, I'll be a new pastor. I haven't been a pastor before. Our worship pastor, she's not been a worship pastor before. Everyone else doing all the other logistical things for the church, they haven't done those things before. So a lot of the literature on church planning recommends doing monthly services, 3 or 4 of them. And that gives you more space in between to really think about, hey, did that go the way that we want to go? Or are there things we want to tweak? And gives us more time to work on various things. So that our first monthly service will be in September, and then we'll do September, October, November, December. We'll start weekly services in January. And that's when I'll transition from my job as an actuary to being paid full-time as a pastor for the church.
And what's the name of your church?
The name is Compass Christian Church. And the name is sort of a fun story. We were trying to think about what we wanted to communicate through our name. And really the idea behind Compass is that Jesus is the compass, that the true north, or the way that we're trying to go, we're trying to get to the Father, and Jesus is the way to do that. And so he points the direction right toward the Father. So
I like that. That's good. So how could people find out about this church, either if they're in the Louisville area, or imagine even if they're not in the Louisville area, but they want to support you or find out more about it for some reason?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have a website. It's Compass Lou. So compass, just like you'd normally spell the word compass, and then Lou, L-O-U, it's sort of shorthand for Louisville around here locally. So compasslou.org is our website, and it has a lot of information about us, about me, about the other founders in our church plant team. And we're just planning on expanding the website from here. So there'll be more and more information available over the summer.
And I'll put links down in the description of the video to make it easier for people to find that. So what church or denomination or network or stuff are you going to be connected to? What's the structure like there?
Yeah, so and we'll get into more of my bio later, but I grew up as a Biblical Unitarian. So there's not like a Biblical Unitarian church planning network yet. Maybe there will be someday, I don't know, but as of right now, we don't have something like that. So the way this whole thing started was I always wanted to be a pastor, and tried to work it out through the church I grew up in, which we'll talk about later a little bit. and it didn't work out, long story short. And so for the last 7 years, I've been trying to think about, what does life after that dream look like? And I've been pretty satisfied with my job, but it's not my dream. So always sort of was praying to God, trying to figure out, would this pastoring thing work out or not? About a year ago, a friend of mine named Sean Finnegan, who's a pastor of a church in New York called Living Hope.
Yeah, Sean Finnegan's been on my channel before, so I'll link to that episode too. That was also a good conversation.
Yeah, so he reached out to me and he was just like, hey, what do you think about planting a church in Louisville? And I was like, yeah, let's do it, So first had to have the conversation with my wife and talk about what that would mean for us. And we got on board with that and then have moved forward from there. And it's just been a really cool ride since then, because you start on something as ambitious as a church plant and you're asking people to commit a lot, commit financially, commit to move in some cases. And we've had 4 other couples over the course of last year who've committed to move and be part of the church planning team. And so it's been a really fun ride, and God has done some amazing things for us, opening up jobs in really crazy ways for people, opening up houses in pretty crazy ways for people. In fact, today, recording this on a Friday, today I'm heading down the hill, the 2 houses down. One of our church planning couples found a house, two houses down from our house, which our neighborhood doesn't usually get a lot of action in the house selling market. And they wanted to be in a place that had a little bit more land and out in the country a little bit, and but also in a subdivision. So I said, well, it sounds like our neighborhood, but I don't know if anything in our neighborhood is going to come up. And anyway, it was just sort of crazy. The wife came in for a visit on short notice and was just expecting to look at different neighborhoods, not even necessarily look at houses. And that week that she came down, the house two houses down came on the market, and they liked it, made an offer, got accepted, even though there were plenty of other offers. And lo and behold, they're going to be closing on that house next week. So
that's pretty amazing. So you've got a growing, tight-knit neighborhood community there in addition to the church plant. That's really great.
That's right. Yeah.
So what kind of what's the church going to be like? How will it, you're going to start with monthly and then hopefully probably proceed to weekly at some point when that becomes more viable. Right. What will the services be like? What will the preaching and the theology be like? How do you envision that?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that's unique about biblical Unitarianism in general is we can't point to a lot of tradition or creeds or like a larger historical infrastructure for what we do. And so we're already a new church, right? Yeah. We're a new church in a tradition that doesn't really have tradition or much of one, you know. Yeah. And so how do you gain credibility in a situation like that? So that's one question you have to consider. The other question you have to consider is, what is the church culture that you want in terms of the church? And I come from a more rigid doctrinal background where, you know, some questions were allowed, but other questions were not really as open. And so we want to create an environment at Compass where no questions off limits. You know, people come in, they're new to the faith. They can ask whatever questions they want to ask. People come in that disagree with us very heavily on X, Y, or Z doctrinal issue. I'd love to have those conversations with people. And so the way that our statement of faith is written, we've tried to make a minimalist statement of faith to begin with. And then on top of that, at the very beginning, we basically say, you know, look, we're humans, we're fallible. We could get things wrong. This is what we currently believe. We plan to review this at least every 3 years, if not more. And we want to have conversations about even these things. And so, you know, the leadership, the people who are being leadership at the church will, of course, have to agree with the statement of faith. The people who want to be members will just have to agree to respect the statement of faith. But the people coming in off the street, you know, we want to create as an open environment as possible for theological discussion. And really nothing's off topic in my mind. You know, so if Trinitarians come in, even though we're biblical Unitarian, and they want to talk to us about John 1, they want to talk to us about Colossians or Philippians 2, we're ready to have those conversations and would love to have those conversations. And on some of those things, obviously, we feel pretty strongly about and probably won't change our perspective on. But we're not going to disfellowship people just because they disagree with us. We want to create an environment where people all across all sorts of different spectrums will feel comfortable coming and listening. And they may hear things that they disagree with, but hopefully it'll be said. I'll try to pitch things in a humble way and say, look, this is what I believe. Of course, everyone preaches or teaches what they believe, and so I have to do that. I have to hold to my conscience, but I'm a very open person, and I really do think in a lot of cases there are multiple ways of looking at Scripture, and it's in some cases very difficult task to put ourselves in a time machine and really travel back to that time and that place where the Bible was written, and really get at the true meaning. So I definitely think that having a lot of perspectives and listening to a lot of perspectives, it can be very helpful along that truth-seeking journey.
Yeah, well, that's a very exciting combination of things. I feel like in general, there's sort of a dichotomy between conservative Protestant churches who are not open to questioning their doctrines. Maybe there's some Westminster Confession of Faith from 400 years ago, or Martin Luther said this, or some Baptist convention at some date in the past said this, and we're not changing, right? And then there's liberal churches, on the other hand, which are perhaps open to discussions, but they might be open to more discussion than you and I would be comfortable with, right. Often probably throwing a high view of Scripture under the bus and that sort of thing, and that there's rarely churches that can hold a tension between a commitment to a high view of Scripture and some amount of lowercase t tradition. Although, like you said, we Biblical Unitarians are in a weird position with relation to tradition, but still have a view of open-mindedness and conversation and even the possibility for intellectual and theological growth.
Mm-hmm. And look, we're having this conversation and talking about it very theoretically. We're going to do our best, but the truth of it is we haven't tried it yet. Yeah. So it sounds good in theory, but praxis is sometimes different. So
sure. So I guess here's a practical question: what will you do with communion? How often will you do it, and then who would be allowed to do it?
We haven't completely had that conversation as a church planning team. I sort of started the conversation a little while ago, and we started talking about it. I lean pretty heavily towards open communion, and I think most of the people on the church planning team agree. I think in our bylaws, we just wanted to carve out that we would do communion at least once a year, because I think that's definitely at the absolute minimum. But I think that there could be a couple different solutions. The location where we're currently hoping to sign a contract with any day now is a synagogue, and they've asked us.
There's something symbolically appropriate about that.
Yes. I feel we joked about how we feel like we're like the Apostle Paul again, like going to the synagogue, and talking. But so anyway, the synagogue, they've been incredibly gracious. But one of the restrictions we have is on food. And so we're actually not allowed to have food inside of the meeting room at all. I think basically we can have water, but we can't have anything besides water in the meeting room itself that we're currently planning on working with. Now, there may be a bigger room down the road that we might use. And that room, they may allow food in because it's a little different, different flooring and different stuff like that. But as of right now, the room that we're planning on being in, you can't have food or anything besides water. So that means you can't do communion in that room. And so we have to think about what we want to do with that. And I think the answer might be communion in small groups. And if we do communion in small groups, then I think it could even be up to the discretion of the small group leader. If they want to do, quarterly, if they want to do monthly, if they want to do a meal weekly and do a prayer and do some sort of symbolic kind of communion, or even invoke the bread and the wine specifically. I think all that's on the table. I mean, I think from a historical or biblical perspective, I think, and maybe you have a different take on this than me, and I'm excited to hear what your take on it is too, but I believe it looks like a weekly meal to me in the earliest church. And so if and I'm not saying we have to go back to what the earliest church did, but it seems to me like that's what they did. And so we definitely want to include meals quite a bit with Compass and what we're doing. Whether I want to commit to a weekly church meal on a larger scale, I don't know. But yeah, what are your thoughts? I'm interested in your thoughts on communion too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard from scripture alone to make a very strong case that it was weekly, but it would be hard to make a case that it was anything other than weekly too. And then when you look at early church history, it's almost unanimously weekly. And so that's one of those questions where how much weight do you give to the evidence of, say, the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christian history? And I feel like because that is so overwhelmingly weekly, and there's nothing in scripture that seems to cut against that idea, and even some things like, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. Well, how often were they doing it, right? Like, I think that one could say there's a soft, a weak to medium strong case of weekly communion from scripture, and then history seems to support that. And so you would need some scriptural argument that overweighed the history, in my opinion, to say that was anything other than weekly.
Take on open versus closed too. I'm curious.
Good question. I mean, so it's funny because I flirt around Protestant or even, Trinitarian Protestant evangelical churches. And so I look for churches that have open communion for obvious reasons. So I appreciate churches that have open communion, but sometimes I feel like, this is one of those things where it's hard to know what's appropriate in our setting. When we're going back and we're looking at the early church, obviously there are some things that we want to keep the same. And then there are some things that were relevant to their time and place that are not relevant to our time and place. And it's sometimes hard to parse that out. Like, we have parking lots and light switches and fire alarms in your church building or your synagogue building. And, nowhere in the book of Acts does it command there to be a parking lot in the church building, right? So those are obviously some cultural contextual things. No one thinks that that's a theological problem. But I think that in its early setting, Christianity was such a tight-knit, persecuted, clear boundaried thing, right? That it was obvious if you were in or out, and you got in through the process of baptism. And it was mostly adult baptism, as far as I can tell, early on. But is that because it was just mostly adult converts coming into the church, or, what did they do with children who grew up in the church? That's actually that's a question that's a little bit hard to answer. But because there was such a clear boundary between who is in and who is out, I don't think the category of open versus closed communion made sense to them. It was just like, you've been baptized into our church, and now you can take communion. If you're not, you can't. And if you're not even there. So like, right. But when we live in like a broadly Christian culture, and there's all these other denominations and people coming from all sorts of other Christian backgrounds, how does that intersect with a new church plant and whether or not these people should be allowed to take communion in that church? That's a hard question, because there isn't quite a circumstance like that in the New Testament or even in early Christian history. So part of me feels like a closed table of members of the church only is in some way more faithful in spirit to the early church. But like I said, it's just such a different circumstance. It's hard to make that argument very effectively. I don't know.
That's fascinating. No, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think one of the things that we're thinking about quite a bit is, like, for example, we talked about membership earlier. Our requirement for membership is not that someone agrees with us on our statement of faith. Our requirement is they agree to respect the statement of faith in the context of Compass. Yeah. And so in other words, if a Trinitarian comes in and wants to be a member of Compass, they're still Trinitarian. We're going to let them be members of Compass, as long as they're not going around after the meeting on Sunday and saying, hey, Pastor Will's wrong about this, Trinity thing. Yeah. The Trinity is really the right, as long as they don't go around doing that, we're going to be totally fine. So we wanted to, sort of, again, create an environment that's very open, and very honest. And so, how do you handle this, wide variety of views? And like you said, I don't want to give someone like, hey, here, really quick, have you accepted Christ before we do this communion thing? It's sort of an interesting problem in modern times. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah, I think sort of a uniting principle of your church that you're talking about is a strong belief in the conscience of the individual, right? As the source of how God works. And then individuals in company and concert and in good faith dialogue moving towards God, right? That's why you would have something like a open-ended statement of faith clause and the other sorts of things that you're talking about. So I think with that in mind, an open table communion it makes sense with that, because it's like, hey, this is on you to decide if it's proper for you to be doing this, just as it's for you to, take seriously the task of theological learning and exploration and dialogue. So I think that those two things would go together for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk more about your story. I'll let you start wherever you want, but tell us in more detail about your story and how you came to be Will, the actuary in Louisville, starting a church.
Yeah. So I grew up, my parents are from Kansas. I grew up, so I have mostly non-regional diction. You'll hear a little bit of Southern accent creeping now and then, and certainly with my vocabulary, sometimes you'll hear it, because I grew up mostly in Little Rock, Arkansas. My parents were part of the Way International, which is a Biblical Unitarian church that's basically built on small groups. So there's one or two physical locations. There's really one physical church, and that's in the middle of nowhere in Ohio, about 45 minutes north of Dayton. So there's one physical church, but then everywhere around the country and in some cases all over the world, there's small groups mostly. And so I grew up in a small group in the Way, and my parents at times were Bible study coordinators for the Way. At times we attended someone else's Bible study. But my parents instilled in me a love for God and a love for the Bible from my earliest days. And there were some isolating aspects of growing up in the Way and being a part of a small group instead of being part of a larger church organization. There definitely were times when you felt, especially as a kid, there weren't a lot of other kids around and stuff like that.
Did you go to public school?
I did. Yep. I grew up in public school. Yep.
Yeah. So you, so like me, so for the audience out there who may or may not know, I didn't grow up in the Way International itself like Will did, but I grew up in a fellowship that had split off from the Way International. The Way's founder died in 1984 or five. And then there was a kerfuffle after that, and some people stayed, some people left. So I grew up in a fellowship that had left, but it was basically a home fellowship in the northern part of Chicago that then kind of turned into something between a home fellowship and a church, right? And because we were drawing from such a large geographical area, from the whole, basically northern half of Chicagoland, there was almost no one in my church or fellowship that went to school with me, except for my little sister. And so there was I would say, a pretty hard divide between kind of church life and not church life because of that. And it sounds like you were in a somewhat similar position.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. I have two younger brothers, and so at times, we would be in the same school. But yeah, very frequently we were the only two or three, depending on, my youngest brother is 5 years younger. So when I graduated high school, the following year, he was a freshman. So we never went to high school together. So, it was my brother, Zach, and me. That was it for people who were in the Way in our high school, for example.
And so then you went to college, you went to Vanderbilt, right?
That's right. I went to Vanderbilt in Nashville, and so I always loved math. and was good at it, or at least they told me that I was good at it. Did certain tests and competitions and stuff like that. I guess, grew up as a full-fledged nerd and all that. So at some point in high school, I think it was sophomore year, I took my first physics class. And that's sort of where the light came on even further. I always thought, maybe I'd study math in college, but then, stumbling across physics, I was like, wait, we can literally take math and we can apply it very directly into the study of nature, the study of stars and all this other crazy stuff. And so I just loved physics and fell in love. And so, yeah, by the time I decided to go to college, I knew I was going to be a physics major and was hoping to do a philosophy major and a math minor. Mm-hmm. And I took a couple classes at Vandy's philosophy department, and it just didn't work out for me. And, you'd love to say with a breakup like that it wasn't me, it was them. But I think it was probably a little bit of both. It was probably a little bit of me and a little bit of them.
That's funny.
Yeah. So yeah, I ended up with a math and physics degree. And
so it sounds like your parents highly valued education.
Yeah.
And because some parts of the way or the X way are maybe a little bit more skeptical of secular learning or secular education, you might say. But it sounds like you grew up in a family environment that was supportive of that, and supportive of you going to a really good secular university.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that were unique about my particular family, I guess, in the context of the way. The first was that even though, like I sort of briefly mentioned before, the way portrays itself to the outside as a biblical research ministry, among other things. And they essentially advertise that you can ask whatever questions you want to ask. And that's, I think, essentially true if you're a new person. If you're brand new to the way and you come into a home fellowship, you can ask all the questions in the world. But once you get sort of more initiated or further along in their class series and into leadership and stuff like that, the window, at least historically, they're trying to reform certain aspects of the way. Even as we speak, there's a new president and he's initiating some reform. So I really be very careful here that my experience is limited to, the 30 years, starting, 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, essentially, if you're in leadership, you can't ask. There are a lot of questions you can't ask. You can't, question certain doctrines and that sort of thing. That's sort of that's all off the table. But my dad's perspective on all of that from the very beginning, I mean, we were young. And I remember him constantly saying to us, it doesn't matter where we go. It doesn't matter if we're in a way fellowship. Doesn't matter if we're attending a Catholic mass, which we did on occasion because my mom grew up Catholic and we visit family and we go to Catholic mass.
Honestly, our stories are so similar. Sometimes it's kind of weird. My mom grew up Catholic, and I also went to way more than my fair share of Catholic masses and weddings and funerals too, and had this kind of weird secondary dose of Catholicism in addition to what. Anyway,
it's wild, isn't it? Yeah.
Continue.
Yeah. So my dad would just always, before we go into a situation like that, he'd always say, look, it doesn't matter who's talking. You always check everything with what the Bible says. And at the end of the day, that's what matters, is what the Bible says. And he included in that group, like I said, people in the way. I mean, he didn't say question everyone outside the way and accept everything you hear from someone who's from the way. No, it was a blanket statement. Anybody who ever teaches you the Bible, you check that, what they're saying against the Bible, no matter what. So there was a very healthy skepticism that my dad instilled in all of us. And I remember having that conversation with my brothers too, in all of us from a very young age. And so I think that was relatively unique in the way international, in the period I grew up in, at least.
Yeah, and I would say something similar about my parents too. Like my dad's a very intellectually curious person, and if you look at his bookshelf, you'll see like some Victor Wierwille works and some biblical concordances and all of the books that you might expect. And then he'll like take a great books course at the University of Chicago, and there's like Nietzsche and David Hume on the shelf right next to it. And so I think that you're right, that the way had this kind of weird double attitude sometimes, where there was this very Berean emphasis, go to the scriptures to make sure these things are true. And even Victor Wierwille himself would say that quite often, that, don't take my word for granted, go and check these things. But yet somehow there was a really, really high level of theological conformity within the way that could sometimes, and even the X way, that could lead to a very propositional brittleness, right? Where even the smallest distinction could be, grounds for breaking off fellowship with people, or a different fellowship or something like that. And that there are still groups that I know of that are like almost to a T on like every single thing, what they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. Right. And but yet some people got the message from this, that theological exploration was good and was the point, and some people didn't. I don't know, and you could find both of those things in there. It was interesting that way.
There definitely to this day are still people that I'm friends with, for example, on Facebook, who are very open to all sorts of different ideas. And I think will make false claims at the leadership of the way, because they're so open. They'll project that onto the leadership of the way and say, hey, like, the leadership of the way is also as open as I am. And that's just not been my my experience with the high up leadership in the way. But there are people out there in the way that are very open-minded, that are intellectually curious, that are always learning. And they, I think a lot of times there's some cognitive dissonance that comes from that. And that can be difficult for people to deal with too. But yeah, I mean, I grew up in an environment where essentially from the moment I was real little, I was taught, to think independently, to think critically, and to look at the Bible with as fresh eyes as I could manage in our day and time, in our culture, going back to an ancient text, and just do my best to try to understand what the Bible's trying to say, and how to live that out. And then, like you said, on top of that, my family really did value education. And so, we were always, pointed to the direction of college and higher learning and all of that. And so I had a really wonderful upbringing, honestly. I'm very thankful for how I was raised and for the environment which that I grew up in. So.
So what was it like when you went to college? Did you join a Christian fellowship or anything like that? Or did you go to church, or what was your, it can be hard going to a high caliber secular school as a religious person. What was that like?
Yeah. So, it was really interesting. I thought a lot about, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I thought a lot about science and faith, especially since I was going to study hard science before I even showed up on campus. And the way had ways of prescribing certain things, and the way was an old earth creationist, for example, church, and so there were a lot of easy ways to incorporate the physical evidence in with an old earth framework. So I think I had some apologetic, some light apologetic background already before I went to college, but there was in the process of looking at colleges, I really wanted to be at least within 30 minutes or so from a way fellowship, and there were a couple of way fellowships in Nashville, and so I continued attending a way fellowship while I was in college, and I did attend other churches and did church hop a little bit to see what else was out there, but I did not. There was a
like Campus Crusade or something like
that.
Yeah,
there were organizations like that. There was even like a Christian fraternity, and in hindsight, I really wish I'd plugged in to some of those things a little bit more. I think at the time I felt uncomfortable with the whole biblical Unitarian thing, and like, I don't want this to come up. I don't want this to be a sore spot. And it wasn't even like I couldn't happily coexist with them. It was more of a like, I'm a very honest person. I like to be upfront. Like, for example, earlier I mentioned that I'm going to be leaving my job at the end of the year. I've already told my job I'm leaving at the end of the year. And, here we are, like 9 months in advance or 8 months in advance, so I like being upfront. I like being honest with people. And so I don't know if I just felt like I couldn't fit in or that they would reject me. I just feared that rejection. But yeah, I never really joined a group And I, in hindsight, I wish I'd tried harder on that, honestly. But I did.
Part of me says that you maybe dodged a bullet, you maybe made the right decision, but
maybe.
I mean, I was in a campus ministry in college, and on one level, it was one of the most meaningful things of my entire college experience. A lot of my friends came from that, a lot of my really good relationships, and like I did grow spiritually because of that. But I did end up getting kicked out of leadership once there was a kerfuffle over the Trinity, and that was really hard and really difficult. And maybe it was a good sort of difficult, but it wasn't fun at the time. So
totally, yeah.
So if I remember correctly, you met a girl in college, and that's a part of the story. So if you want to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So even though I didn't, join a Christian organization formally while I was in college, I did have the opportunity to have a lot of theological conversations over the course of my 4 years. And my time in college really was a turning point for me, because I think before that, I said sort of I had like a light apologetic background. I think I essentially knew like what the way taught on a number of different things, but I really didn't know what other churches thought about a lot of things other than what the way had said they thought, like, oh, Trinitarians think this. But I never really read a Trinitarian author. I never really tried to put my mind in their sort of headspace and try to think about things the way a Trinitarian would. I hadn't really gone through the process of making my faith mine. It was sort of like a received faith at that point. And I ran into some difficulties. So I didn't date really at all in high school. I don't know in hindsight exactly why that was. I think I thought girls were trouble and probably not worth the trouble in high school. But my first serious girlfriend was my freshman year of college, and she was Bulgarian Orthodox. She was the daughter of a priest, and we got involved pretty early in freshman year. And so around Christmas time, I went home with her and spent some time with them around the holidays. And I had been to high church before, but I really enjoyed the Orthodox take on high church and really enjoyed my experience. And at that point, we already had the Trinity conversation, and she knew where I stood and I knew where she stood, more or less. And they were very accepting and very kind to me throughout that whole process. And even her father at one point said, hey, if you want to marry my daughter, you could convert to Orthodoxy and you could be a priest just like me, and you could, essentially it's like you could take over this church, and we could make this family thing, And it was a very kind offer of him. But I said, I don't think he wants someone who thinks like me as a priest in the Orthodox Church. I'm pretty unorthodox, actually. But there's this one moment. There's this really crazy moment that really, I think was like the dynamite that sort of set off, boom, this huge explosion and led me on this whole journey. I would call it like a crisis of faith that I tried to resolve really over the next 4, 5, 6 years. It led even after college. And really the search for the truth has continued to this day. It's a never ending search. But what happened was we were talking about the Trinity, and I was, from memory giving my apologetic. I was, 1 Timothy 2:5 and John 17:3, and I was sort of machine gunning, I guess, very slowly. I don't know.
A slow machine gun.
Slow machine gun. The verses I knew, I'd be faster and more full now. But I was doing what I knew, and I was giving her some verses to think about. And at the end of the conversation, after 30, 45 minutes talking, she was just like, well, what about John 1:1? And I couldn't explain John 1:1. And so I pulled down from my bookshelf Victor Werwol's book, Jesus Christ is Not God. And he has a whole chapter on John 1. And I literally started reading it out loud, because I tried to read it in my head and summarize it. And I realized I couldn't read it out, read it and then summarize it to her. I was going to have to read it out loud. So I read it out loud. And as I'm reading, I'm going, I don't believe this. This doesn't seem like a coherent way of handling John 1. There seems to be lots of problems. It seems to be really convoluted and complicated in places that it may not need to be. And so I don't know if that was the spirit or what that was, but anyway, I realized as I was saying this out loud that if I'm going to try to convince this girl to leave her Orthodox faith and to be a biblical Unitarian, heretic like me, I better know what I'm talking about. And if I have to pull down a book that's not the Bible and read straight out of it, and even then I don't feel very convinced about it, that's not a good place for me to be. And so that passage, John 1, sort of launched me into this larger journey. And basically, I had experienced God a couple of times in my life. He had actually, saved my life a couple of times while driving. And I had, felt like I had heard the voice of God a couple of times. And so I did not ever question that Jesus was Lord. I said, I believe Jesus is the Messiah, but basically anything else is on the table. The Trinity is on the table. Interpretations of Genesis, everything from like interpretations of Genesis 1 all the way to the Trinity, from the little things all the way to the big things. So like everything's on the table. And I just wanted to go through and systematically review and correct my theology.
Yeah.
And so I spent a lot of time during college and after college really thinking hard, and to this day, really thinking hard about theology and how to make everything as much as possible make sense. And it's been quite a journey. But it started with that conversation with my girlfriend freshman year about John 1. So it's pretty wild.
That is interesting. And yeah, there, again, a lot of similarities, but some differences. Like in college, I had my first sort of crisis of faith was more about science and religion. I was a biostatistics major, so I had to take a lot of biology classes. Yeah. And so I just brought all of those evolution and Genesis, 1, 2, and 3 questions to the fore in a way that made me really kind of think about it and be like, well, maybe what I was taught wasn't right, and like, okay, so if that's true about this one thing over there, how many things is it possibly true of? And then later on in college, when I was getting, kicked out of leadership for Trinity stuff, it was like, I'd never thought too hard about the Trinity stuff. Every time Trinitarians talk, I'm like, well, that just doesn't make any sense. And, so it was never very tempting or convincing beforehand, but I wasn't very good at defending it. And so then when I was under all of this pressure, from leadership and my fellow students and stuff like that to defend myself, I really had to bolster up. I read through like the whole New Testament in like lightning speed. I read Augustine and like, okay, where did this come from? Like maybe there are some Trinitarians who make sense somewhere. There has to be some who make sense somewhere. And, I think in many ways that exploration that was kicked off there is still going for me too. That's part of the purpose of my podcast and all of those sorts of things too. So, and then, like you said, making your faith your own, making my faith my own, and those sorts of things. And a lot of that was really kicked off by some stuff in college. And I also had some friends who were Orthodox in college and some friends who converted to Orthodoxy. I'm like, well, aren't they just kind of like Greek Catholics, and then like, okay, well, wait a minute, they really like this essence energy distinction when the world's that. And, and still a large portion of my audience is Eastern Orthodox for whatever reason that is, and I still know a lot of people who are either converting to Orthodoxy or ortho curious, as I put it sometimes. So yeah, anyway, so enough about me. So that covers college. So what was your life like kind of post college? And maybe then we'll circle back to John 1 once we catch up closer to the present.
Yeah, so after college, I sort of realized, I guess, once I graduated, that maybe the physics degree wasn't as practical as I thought it might be. That I would, if I wanted to be a professional physicist, I'd have to, get a PhD and
what could be more practical than physics if you live in a physical universe,
I know, right? Yeah. It just sort of dawned on me, senior year, I'm looking at jobs and I'm like, everything that I would want to do from a science perspective requires like a master's and above. And I'm like, I am done with physics and math, man. I don't want to do anymore. And so anyway, yeah. So I always knew sort of like my backup option was to teach. And so that's what I did. I taught. I spent a short stint in a manufacturing facility as an engineer, and then moved on to teaching. And so I did that, and I ended up getting a master's degree in secondary education from Ohio State. And during that time was before I moved to Columbus to get the master's degree at Ohio State. I was dating my wife long distance, proposed, and then when I moved up the year.
And your wife is not the daughter of the Bulgarian priest.
No.
Just
No.
clarifying that. Yes.
She moved back. She moved back home, which was Massachusetts, and ended up going to Gordon and met a nice Orthodox boy, I think, at Gordon, and they're married now with multiple kids, and
maybe
I think
that's for the best.
Yeah, they're very happy. I think happily ever after for them, happily ever after for me, and I wish them, really do wish them all the best. I met later in college my future wife, and we were both in a position where we couldn't date. So it was a couple years later we reconnected, started dating long distance. Then I moved up to Columbus, where she was getting her undergrad in nursing then. And so when we both graduated from Ohio State, it was like, what's the next step? We both wanted to be ministers in the way. And so we really aggressively pursued that. So we moved to Atlanta. We worked with some ministers in Atlanta for a couple of years. We went on the 6-month mission trip that people do in the way before they go into seminary at the way. And we did that successfully, planted a large Bible study west of Detroit. Have some really cool stories from that. Even though I don't think that the way is, like the best church or, necessarily the best spiritual environment for people, even in I'm going to use the term broken, even in broken environments, God can work amazing things. Like even during that 6-month mission, we at least one person that we reached said she was planning on committing suicide shortly before we met her, and she's alive, married today, and her life changed, with meeting Christ and coming to God, and the way was the vehicle for that. And so the way is not, all bad. There's God can work through people in the way and through people in every church.
Yeah.
And that's so important.
To give the way credit, like I mostly associate the way with baby boomers, which is why it's a little bit, sometimes you break my category on that a little bit, but when I go to like X-Way fellowships, it seems like almost everyone was born between 1950 and 1956 or something like that.
Totally.
But it had a talent for attracting otherwise lost members of sort of that baby boomer hippie generation who had been spiritually curious and maybe had gone down some very dark places in terms of either dark spirituality or drugs or hippie culture and that sort of thing, and pulling them out and setting them on a path, that emphasized studying the Bible and got them out of some very dark places. And it was very good at that. And that I think that sometimes some of the rigidness of the way is sort of a counter reaction to the chaos of a lot of the background of a lot of the members before they were in the way. Absolutely. And that it kind of gives me a little bit more sympathy, honestly, for some of its kind of more rigid aspects when I think of it as something of an antidote to chaos. And so anyway,
absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. And we definitely saw that on the people that we reached were people who needed that kind of a structure, at least in the short term, to get past whatever they're dealing with, whether it was suicide in one case. And another guy that we met that we spent a lot of time with was still dealing with the aftermath of a really bad divorce. And he had come out of alcohol and drug addiction and just needed some friends and some support. So I mean, we definitely did some good on that mission trip and felt like God moved in a lot of ways during that time. And then shortly after that, we went into the Way Seminary, which is usually a 2-year program, and we lasted about 1.5 years. And then I was asked to put together a document giving feedback. I had mentioned that I had some feedback that I wanted to submit on several of the Way's classes. In particular, this was their foundational class. And a lot of it, if you look back, looking back at the document I submitted, from my perspective, compared to where I am now theologically, it's really tame. Like, it's very tame. But anyway, that was enough to get me kicked out.
And the way's big on classes. These pre-recorded, hosted classes. It was one of the way's main methods of teaching and spreading, was hosting classes, people attending classes, and then there was kind of like a hierarchy of classes that you could take. So that's very fundamental to the structure of the way. And sometimes I still notice that people, even with kind of faint way backgrounds, all of a sudden have an idea, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach a class. I'm like, well, where'd that idea? I'm going to record a class and then we'll teach it to people. And it's like that. And I'm not saying that that's bad, because I probably could be somewhat accused of doing the same thing. But yeah, that is kind of part of that culture and that legacy.
Totally. Yeah. And today, thinking about it today, it's like you wish that, like, for example, in Compass, we're not going to do a class series like the Way did, for the reasons that you gave, but we will do, like, shorter topical videos and put them on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And now the Way, as of right now, doesn't do that. They don't make their materials that publicly available.
Because they also make money from people attending the classes in person.
They do, but I think it's an outdated model. I think they're going to really have to reconsider that, because people are not going to want to come and sit. So, like, for example, their foundational class, it's 24 hours of instruction over 12 different sessions, and you have to attend each of those sessions on time and not miss any time at all in order to complete the class. And there even have historically been, I don't know what the rules are now, but historically there have been rules about, like, you have to have 5 or 7 people that are new students who have never taken the class before, just to run a class. And then you have to repeat classes to go to the next class. So they have a lot of classes. There's, so anyway, there's all these different rules and things. I just don't think modern society is going to allow for that much longer. I'm actually surprised the model's lasted as long as it has without more pushback from the public. But I think we're going to get there. I think eventually they'll end up doing what everyone else does, and that's putting their content on YouTube for free.
Yeah, and then they'll affect financial structures and stuff like that. But so, how did you become an actuary? Just quickly.
Yeah, so I was really interested actually in it after college, and my uncle knew someone who was at an actuarial firm in Nashville when I graduated, and I interviewed with him, and he would have hired me. But what he told me was, he said, you're gonna have to work 60 hours a week to start, because I'm gonna work you 40 hours a week, and then you're gonna want to study for these tests. Yeah. And at that point, I was long distance with my future wife, and I knew I didn't have 60 hours a week to do something professionally. And I also knew, depending on the trajectory of my life, I sort of figured I wasn't gonna have the time to sort of run the gauntlet. There were like 5, at that time, there were 5 actuarial exams I needed to pass before I get my first actuarial credential. And so I just sort of didn't know if I would have the time to run that gauntlet before we wanted to go into seminary at the Way. And I sort of wanted to focus on that, and I didn't feel like 60 hours a week in my secular profession leading up to that would be the best way to put my efforts really into being a minister long-term. And so I made that decision. And then when we got booted from the Way Seminary, it was in the middle of the school year. So as a teacher, I'm not going to get a job for the rest of the year. So I substitute taught, and I got hired at a tutoring firm, which was a great gig. The tutoring center was a fantastic opportunity for me because it was real flexible hours and it paid really well. And so I applied for some teaching jobs, but then I thought, hey, I'm almost 30. This whole major life change has just happened where I thought my life was going in this direction, and now I'm heading this completely different direction, completely different trajectory. And it was like, maybe this is a good time for a career change. Mm-hmm. And so I just sort of prayed and I asked God to open the right door. And I knew exactly where I wanted to teach. I wanted to teach private school, not public school, because I knew that I couldn't emotionally handle failing like half of my Algebra 1 kids, which had happened to me in prior public school experiences. I just couldn't emotionally deal with that. It was very difficult to do that. And so I knew I needed to be in a private school. I applied to a couple private schools, had some great leads. In fact, my wife's grandmother was like, my wife's grandmother was like this rock star teacher at one of the local private schools here in Louisville, where my father-in-law grew up. And I got an interview there and mentioned her name. And she's she's on their Hall of Fame. She's like one of their top 5 teachers of all time. And I didn't get that job, as a person who had experience in the nicest private school in Atlanta, coming, degrees in math and physics from Vandy, having good academic credentials. I didn't get that job. And so when that door closed, I just started in earnest studying for actuarial exams, and I passed the first 2 very quickly, and then got the job at Humana as an analyst.
I failed the first actuarial test in my senior year of college one time, and decided that I wasn't. What
was it P or was it FM? Which one did you take? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Okay.
The first one, I don't know. I think it was. Oh,
was it on probability?
Yes, it was probability. So
that's P. Yep.
Yeah. So I just figured I didn't really study for it. I was like, man, I'm a statistics major. I've taken probability theory. I can just like kind of show up to this thing.
Yeah.
That didn't work. And so I'm like, man, I'm not becoming an actuary. Never mind. Because, being in a biostatistics major, maybe a quarter of my classmates became actuaries. So I'll check that out. So anyway.
You would have made it. There's no doubt. There's no doubt you would have made it. Yeah, you probably could have studied for that test for like 25 hours and passed it.
Yeah. 2 hours didn't work, unfortunately.
No,
25 might have done it. So.
Yeah, the average person to pass those prelim tests, they study between 100 and 200 hours to pass those tests.
Wow.
But yeah, you would have passed P with very minimal studying. But you would have had probably problems with some of the later tests like I did. And that happens. Some material, as coming from biostatistics, there's some things that your mind just clicks with, and there's some things that your mind doesn't. Like, for example, Newtonian mechanics, I'm your guy. General relativity, I'm your guy. Electricity and magnetism, don't ask me a thing about E&M. I will steer you literally the wrong direction. My instincts about E&M are terrible. I think I don't remember what I made in college, but it was like, I don't know if I made it must have been a B or a B minus. My worst grade in all of college was in electricity and magnetism. I could ace all the Newtonian mechanics and
that's funny.
And the astronomy classes. I was your guy there, but man, E&M, no, thank you.
That's hilarious. All right, so we need to talk about. So you got interested in John 1. You had this conversation with the Bulgarian priest's daughter and the Bulgarian priest, and you're like, man, my explanation of John 1 doesn't make sense. I've read Victor Werwol's explanation in John 1, and it seems lacking. And you've gone through various seminary classes and stuff at the Way International, and so you want to give some feedback on that. So let's pick up the story back from there.
Yeah, so really starting when I was in college, I realized, hey, I can't explain this. So what I started doing is I started really reading both sides, and I've probably read 10 or 12 books on both sides of the Trinity, Unitarian debate, and really tried to understand what a Trinitarian believes. There are a lot of things, for example, in Victor Werwol's book that really was more of an attack against like modalism than it was against like a classical Trinity. And so I realized I had a lot of misconceptions about what a Trinitarian believes,
although
and how they approach the scripture.
It is probably a decently good attack against common folk Trinitarianism.
Yes.
That is what you would find most people believing if they have some amount or even a good amount of education on the topic. But it isn't criticizing what, say, Thomas Aquinas or Augustine believes about the Trinity.
No. And that's what would happen is I would hand the book, Jesus Christ and Not God, to people. And if the person was like a reasonably intellectual Trinitarian, they just hand it back to me and be like, this didn't really do much for me. Yeah. But if they were, less educated on some of the more advanced thinking, they'd be like, oh yeah, there was interesting stuff here. And, it attacks some of this, successfully. And, anyway, so I just sort of started reading a lot on both sides, as well as like I read through the New Testament like multiple times in college. Just kept reading through the New Testament There was a particular summer I spent abroad where I just like, my goal was just to read through the Gospels. And I was just trying to understand, like, how does Jesus relate to his Father? Like, that was really like the focus of like me reading through the Gospels, is like, what's going on here? And then during that time when I was overseas, I was also really studying and reading for the first time like church fathers, which, you know, like the Way doesn't talk at all about church fathers. There's nothing about church history. It's just like church history begins when Victor Whirl starts the Way in the
Right.
40s or something, you know, like that's when it starts.
And there's sometimes even an emphasis that almost even in the church, the New Testament period, that the church almost like failed to launch.
Right.
Like
Yes.
it like such like some Protestants will be like, okay, around the time of Constantine or something like that,
Right.
things started to go off track. But for some reason, we still like the Council of Nicaea, right? And like, you know, so there's a couple hundred years, and then it got Catholic, and then and then Martin Luther got it back on track, and then my denomination got it even more on track, right?
Right.
But the Way was even more pessimistic than that about church history, where it was like, I'm not even sure if some of the churches that Paul was writing to ever really got it.
Correct. Yes. Yes, exactly. Yeah, they taught from Timothy that, like everyone fell away from Paul toward the end of his life, and things were getting pretty bleak, and I think maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe there's something in Paul's mind, some essential doctrine that people are missing out on as early as 65 AD or 67 AD or whatever. Maybe there was something like that, but it just seems like, looking macroscopically back at the early church history, it seems like there aren't a lot of major blips like that until you get, like you said, later in the 300s and 400s and stuff like that. So yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I keep derailing you.
No, that's great. Yeah. So I was reading church fathers for the first time in my life, and they'd always been used as like a hammer to like bludgeon me for being a Unitarian. Oh, everybody was a Trinitarian. So I was sort of, I guess, afraid maybe of reading them. I don't know. But at some point I sat down and started reading, Origen and Tertullian. And, I was just reading what I could find online. And, I remember one day very vividly, it was a day I was off from class. I was taking a Scottish history class in Scotland, which was a lot of fun, playing a lot of golf too. I don't know if you're a golfer, but
I am. Yeah.
So another commonality there. So I was playing golf. I was, as my mom would say, I majored in golf that summer. So I was playing a lot of golf, but I was also reading the Gospels, and I was reading the church fathers in conjunction with the Gospels. And I remember one specific day, I forget which passage it was, but I came across Justin Martyr, Tertullian, somebody saying something very subordinationist. And I realized, because I, at that point, had done enough, I was age 20. At that point, I had read enough Trinitarian stuff to know that's not modalism. That's not traditional Trinitarianism. This is a unique animal in the wild. I'm observing this new animal in the wild. I've never observed it before.
Yeah.
And there was a guy in our program from a different school studying Scottish history with me. And he was very well versed. He was from a more mainline background and was very well versed in the church fathers. And he was having a conversation with another person in our program. And I just sort of barged into this common area and stopped him in the middle of a sentence and said, hey, I'm reading these church fathers, and it doesn't look to me like they're Trinitarian. I mean, I was just like rude, like awful, just like terrible human dynamics there. But I had this urgent question that needed answering. And he said, look, I'm having a conversation. We can talk about this later. I said, I don't care about your conversation. That's not important. What's important is whether the church fathers believed in classical Trinitarianism or not. Can you just answer?
I need to know
right now. I need to know right this second. And he was like, no, they weren't modern Trinitarians. Are you happy? And I said, yes, thank you. And I just ran out of the room. And I'm sure they talked about me after I left and what a complete idiot I am and was, which I was. I was a jerk. But my question, I will contend to this day, my question was more important than whatever gossip they were talking about. I will contend that was right, but I could have done it better, I'm sure. But his confirmation was huge for me, because now I've got a Trinitarian from a mainline church who's read more church fathers than me agreeing, hey, these guys were not Trinitarians in our modern sense. And that just opened up a whole new world of discovery for me. And I know you've done a lot more in church fathers than I have, but really it helped me feel comfortable that, hey, biblical Unitarianism, it can be historically coherent as well as biblically coherent.
Yeah. I'll also say the early church fathers were not Trinitarians in the modern sense. You're right.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And that is an important question.
It is. It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And honestly, sometimes it takes a non-Trinitarian to see them for what they're saying. You know,
Right.
most of the church fathers are not biblical Unitarians. That's equally true. But it takes someone who, because honestly, Trinitarians get so good at reading even the New Testament in their own theology that they can basically shoehorn anything that comes at them into their theology, and they don't have eyes to see something else. And when you have eyes to see something else, and you're reading Justin Martyr, and he's mocking the Jews for thinking that the God that talked to Moses was the true highest God instead of it being the secondary God, you know, it's like, that is not Trinitarianism. No, I'm sorry. No. Yes.
Not even close. Yeah.
Not even close. Yeah. There are two gods. They're distinct. One of them you can't see, and one of them you can see. And the Jews are silly for not noticing the difference. Right. Yeah. And
totally.
Etc.
Yeah.
All right. John 1.
So anyway, so after that period, I resolved a lot of the issues I had. You know, I felt comfortable with Colossians 1. I got more comfortable with Philippians 2. I got more comfortable with Hebrews 1. But John 1, for whatever reason, it just sort of kept being sticky for me for a long time. And part of that, honestly, I think was the Way's history with that text too. Because, you know, Victor Werwol didn't exhaustively handle really any text in his book, Jesus Christ is Not God, except for John 1. Like, that was like the only text where he literally goes through verse by verse the whole prologue and tries to address all these different issues that he sees in the text. And like for example, Philippians 2, which a lot of people would consider almost on the same level as John 1, he gives like a paragraph or maybe two paragraphs to, and he gives like pages and pages to John 1. And so I think I knew maybe instinctively that the Way would be open to amending, correcting things in Colossians or Philippians 2, but they may not be as interested in something on John 1 because it was like a 25-page chapter. It was
already treated.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And
if you were adding pages to a couple paragraphs, that would be seen as assisting the cause. But if you were correcting pages that had already been written, that's a slightly different thing. Do you want to give like a high-level overview of how Victor Werwol does interpret John 1?
Yeah, so he says that the word logos can mean several different things in John 1:1. So he would say, in the beginning was the Word, was the revealed Word or actually he would say the Word that is God. He would say the word that is God. There's sort of like the revealed Word, and then there was the word that is God. So there's two different words. And he'd say, for example, the word that's with God, that's the revealed Word. And the way that it was with God is in his foreknowledge. So like the stars, the Bible, the person of Jesus Christ, those things were with God in his foreknowledge. And then there's a second sense the word logos gets used at the end of the verse, where that's God himself. He just is his word in some sense. And I think it's a little fuzzy at times. But I think they're comfortable with like what God was, the Word was. You know, I don't know if you've heard that translation before, but I think people from that background are comfortable with that translation too. And so jumping back to the beginning, in the beginning was the Word. They'd say that was the Word that was God. So you have logos used at the beginning of the verse saying, here's the Word that is God. Then you've got the revealed Word with God. Then you've got it re-emphasizing the Word that was God. And then when it says the same was in the beginning with God, it's going back to that second occurrence. So you're jumping back and forth between usages in a way that's, I think, foreign to my, so I also took Greek. I took a year of Greek in college, and what little Greek I had at that time and still carry with me to this day, we know that the text doesn't normally do that. That when you use a word, it generally means the same thing in the whole context, unless the context absolutely demands it. And so with that little amount of Greek training I had at the time, and then with this sort of, when I step back from it a little bit, this sort of post hoc, like having to shoehorn different usages into the first two verses there, like alternating. It seemed to be like a very difficult reading. There were other issues, like there was an issue that he had with like dia and the genitive, where he said it meant one thing in John, and then later in the book he said it meant another thing in Hebrews, and those are completely contradictory. And so there were, and lots of critics of his latched on to stuff like that, where he was inconsistent in his application of Greek grammar. So, there's technical things there too, but by and large, that's John 1:1 in a nutshell. Was there's these different usages of the word, and it's in the same verse without really any context clues to help you with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you either have to come up with different uses of the word logos or different uses of the word God in John 1. And almost everyone will have to say that some of the words in that verse are being used in multiple senses in the same verse. Right. Like most Trinitarians will say, when the word is with God, that's the second person of the Trinity being with the first person of the Trinity. So there the word God means first person of the Trinity. And the word was God. Okay, well, now we're talking about the divine essence to say that the second person of the Trinity has the divine essence. Right. So they've changed the definition of the word God in just the space of a couple words. So, I can't think of any way to make sense of John 1 that doesn't have some amount of equivocation of terms. So I'll cut them some slack that way. But
no, totally. Yeah, no, I agree with you that there has to be some sort of flexibility there. But I'm just saying, like, having a very structured, like this one, the other one, this one, other one. Yeah. It seems like there's something going on there where I just felt, especially at the time, I felt like, there's some special pleading possibly going on here, and maybe there are better explanations. And so, I like I said, I read 10 to 12 books on both sides, trying to sort of piece together a lot of different texts, and John 1 was sort of the big one. And I felt like Buzzard's explanation was pretty good, and he's sort of in the wisdom Christology camp. And so I thought he had some good things to say about all that, and didn't really come across the other view that we're going to talk about until later in life. But what was interesting was I was never fully settled that the wisdom Christology view answered all of my questions in the whole passage. And so, like, I would say for years, and I'm not saying I would go to bed every night and ask God, why did you have John write John 1 the way that you did? Like, what's going on here? But I would say, like, it was a common prayer of mine as I went to sleep many nights over the period of about 5 years, from when I was about 22 to when I was about 27. And one morning I sort of woke up and felt like I had a better answer. And what it was putting yourself in the mindset of a Jewish, maybe new Christian person reading John 1 or listening to John 1 for the first time. There is a sense in which the wisdom Christology, carries through the whole passage. But then I think you get to verse 14 where the word becomes flesh, and it keys off something for you like, oh, he's talking about Jesus. Then you go back to verse 1 and you can read the same passage now thinking about, oh, this could be talking about Jesus's ministry too. And so what happened was in the meantime, I had written a manuscript on the Trinity, and my section on John 1 was very short because I just didn't want to engage in that debate.
Step on any landmines.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I just wanted to hand this off to people in the way and say, look, I'm trying to play nice here. Here are a couple questions about what Victor Orwell said, but I'm not going to really tip my hand as to where I really think this should go with wisdom Christology or anything like that. It was just very brief, like asking a couple questions. Then a later version of the manuscript that I wrote after I sort of had this epiphany, whatever you want to call it, I restructured the whole book to give myself a whole chapter on John 1. And then I laid out sort of side by side this wisdom Christology view versus like this Jesus ministry view, and sort of showed how both could work.
Where did you encounter it's about Jesus's ministry? Or
I didn't formally encounter it until after, like,
really?
Now. Yeah. So now,
so like on your own sort of creativity and inspiration, you kind of came across what you could call the Socinian view, that it's about Jesus's life.
I don't recall reading the Socinian view. It's possible I did read it and just like didn't understand what they were saying or something like that, but I don't recall ever reading it. I recall just having a moment where I woke up one morning and I was like reading through the text again, trying to like asking God over and over again. And like I said, I probably asked God literally in my life 100 times about this text.
Wow,
and just couldn't piece it together. And I finally saw that. And so once I saw it, it's like I had to write it down. And only later have I come across, like you said, there are a lot of people that have done a great job advancing the Socinian view better than what I could put together in my manuscript, like way better. So like I definitely want to go back and like rework that manuscript with a lot of the insights that like Bill Schlegel and others have provided into that text. But I definitely see, that both and there can work, I believe. But I think I told you this before, that it just in general, as I've gotten older, I'm 36 now, so I'm not old. I wouldn't call myself old, but as I've gotten older, I've gotten more and more comfortable with not having like the right answer, that there could be multiple options on the table, and each of them could be good or great options. And I don't feel like I have to like make a decision on like, this is the one way of reading John 1. So I like both views of it. And I also like the both and view. And if we want to separate that into 3 different options, I'm happy to. But yeah.
So let's talk more about the both and view.
Yeah.
So I'll say, I grew up being taught some modified werewolf interpretation, although the leader of my particular fellowship was also in relatively close contact with Anthony Buzzard. So we probably I was probably taught sort of a hybrid werewolf Buzzard, wisdom, it's like, it's God's foreknowledge, and then it takes and then a human lives into God's plan, basically, or something like that. And then the things, the word came to his own and his own rejected him. That's about the Old Testament, right? When the Jews get given the law or various commandments, and then they reject it, and it's about events in the past, and it's sort of God's, either his internal knowledge of the future and plan, or him speaking, and like kind of like the kind of like the wisdom behind scripture, right? Not scripture itself, but like the wisdom behind scripture, right? And then Jesus, is the fulfillment of the plan and the keeping of the promise and that sort of thing, right? And that's sort of, the wisdom Christology. And, you can get a fair amount of traction on that with people who haven't encountered that view before. And you can certainly make some points, but then it's like, okay, well, why in the world is it interrupting this to talk about John the Baptist?
Right. Yeah.
What in the world is John the Baptist doing? Okay, we're talking about how the Jews in the desert didn't accept Moses's covenant. All right. And then we're immediately talking about John the Baptist, and then we switch back to the Old Testament again, and then we have John the Baptist again, and this doesn't really work.
Right.
And then I honestly didn't encounter the Socinian view until Bill Schlegel's podcasts. And I was like, shoot. That makes a lot of sense too. And then I was reading Larry Hurtado's book, One God, One Lord, which I would highly recommend for the record. I think he's basically, I had always wanted to interview him for the podcast, but he passed away before I could reach out to him. But I mean, there are some passages in his book he's basically just saying that the Biblical Unitarians are right, but he can't quite say it in quite that blunt of a way. And then he sort of bleeds in Justin Martyr and some other thing. Anyway, but I was sort of becoming increasingly aware of how the early Christians read the Old Testament in a Christological way. Right? Like there was this sort of spiritual allegorical way in which the stories of the Old Testament are actually also about Jesus. There's like the literal layer, but then there's this Jesus layer. And when you look at a lot of the quotes of the Old Testament in the New Testament, normally they're taking it out of context. They're not putting it in sort of its original authorial intent reading, but they're applying it to Jesus in a new way, right? And I was sort of getting more and more comfortable with that idea, and especially the book of Hebrews just does that all over the place, right? And then I was thinking, like, the Gospel of John does that in sort of a weird kind of way, where when you read the Gospel of John, most of the stories are, there's some Old Testament figure or person, maybe, like the Samaritan woman at the well. We're talking about Jacob and Jacob's well, right? And so the Samaritan woman is like, our forefather Jacob, he gave us this well and we drink water from it, and it like sustains our community. And Jesus is like, I'm more important than Jacob, and I am true water that gives you, there's like the literal water from Jacob's well that nourishes you, but Jesus is like the spiritual water that eternally nourishes you. And in that sense, Jacob points to Jesus, right? Jacob gave you a well with literal water. Jesus, even better than Jacob, he gives you a spiritual well with water that wells up into everlasting life, right? Right. And almost every story in the Gospel of John is like that, where Old Testament thing like the manna that comes down from heaven, or the temple, or Abraham, all of these things. And then there's this way in which Jesus is sort of like all of those things were pointing to Jesus to help you understand Jesus now. And then it's like, well, what if the reconciliation between Bill Schlegel and Anthony Buzzard is that the prologue is doing that too? And that the reason why the prologue's kind of weird and kind of hard to understand, and sometimes it seems like we're talking about the Old Testament, sometimes we're talking about John the Baptist, is that it is telling the story of the whole Old Testament and telling the story of Jesus at the same time. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And so anyway, I've been talking enough. I don't want to steal the mic from you very much. But
no, that's fantastic. Yeah, so I think if you look at both views and you go sort of like verse by verse, and you view it like a courtroom kind of situation where you have like 12 or 14 jurors, or however you want to split it, how far you want to go in the text, verse 12, verse 14, wherever you want to go. If you got 12 jurors, and it's not, I don't think it would be like 12-0 on either interpretation. You've got a split jury no matter how you cut it. There are verses that absolutely fit better with the wisdom Christology. There are verses that absolutely fit better with the Socinian, Jesus' ministry kind of a view. And really, from my perspective, it's pretty evenly split. Like you could say it's 7-5 or 8-4 one way or the other. You could probably convince me that, or 6-6, So it's, from my perspective, that's why I was never totally settled with like the wisdom section, because the wisdom view of it, because there are things in there that are just like crippling to that view that's very difficult to get around. And the same thing is true, I think, of the other perspective. And so that's what really settled in my heart when I was, in my late 20s and had this moment of epiphany or realization that you could read the text that way. It certainly wasn't as advanced as what you just described in terms of seeing the whole Gospel of John doing the same thing. But I did sort of have like a lightning bolt of inspiration. And when that happens, I tend to attribute it to God. I know, the Trinitarians that watch this may be like, well, of course he thinks that God did it because this is a non-Trinitarian explanation of the text. I don't say that as a blunt instrument to like say that we're absolutely right. What I say is, I don't think I'm smart enough to do that on my own. It's a move of humility, not a move meant to end the debate or end criticism against this view. I just want to be very, very clear about that. So
yeah, I would even say that a Trinitarian could honestly do the both and view. I think that Father John Baer, an Eastern Orthodox theologian that I talked with recently, he has a book on the Gospel of John, and I think that he basically is a hybrid Socinian wisdom Christology interpretation of the prologue too. And he, although sometimes he gets so close to biblical Unitarianism, I didn't quite confront him on that live on the air. I asked him more details after the recording was off, and the recording was off, so I won't talk about it. But it was off the record. But anyway, he of all the Trinitarian scholars that I know, he is like a hair's breadth away from biblical Unitarianism. But he had something like a hybrid Socinian wisdom Christology interpretation in John 1. So you wrote a paper about this while you're still in the way, and that gets you in trouble, right?
It does, yeah. In fact, at one point, I got a phone call. This was before I think this was before my realization of the double reading. I just sort of had the wisdom Christology reading at this point. I got a phone call from my minister. What happened was I got to a point with the Trinity manuscript where I submitted to what you're supposed to do in the way is you're supposed to submit to your leadership. So I submitted to my leadership when I lived in Arkansas, and it didn't go anywhere. So I sort of viewed it as case closed. They're not interested, but I still wanted feedback. And I had a friend who was in my dad's generation who lived in Toledo, Ohio. I'd moved to Columbus to go to grad school at that time. And so I sent the manuscript to him just to see, what do you think about this? Is this worth, thinking about it anymore? Or should I just put it on the back burner, so far on the back burner that I, maybe never come back to it? And so what he did is and I don't think he meant to do this, I think it just sort of happened. He told the state and region coordinator who was in Ohio that I had sent him this. And so that tripped off the alarm bells first. And so then he sent it to the region coordinator, who's also the state coordinator of Ohio. And he was angry about the fact that I was interested in revising John 1. And so I ended up writing like a paper just on John 1 and sending it into him. And then he had another minister review it. And basically they said this paper has merit, but they didn't want to pursue it. But yeah, I got yelled at for like an hour about like, who are you to try to revise Dr. Werwol's stuff? And it was just like, I'm not saying I'm better than Dr. Werwol. I'm not saying I'm better than anyone. I'm saying that I had questions, and if I'm having questions, maybe someone else is having these questions too. Why don't we look into these questions and see if there's something we can do to answer them?
Right. And you weren't even really trying to propose a change in doctrine.
No.
You were proposing a change in interpretation that more or less came to the same doctrinal conclusions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how does that kind of end or result in you leaving the way?
Well, that was, I think that's where I probably got my reputation as a renegade. And so the higher up leadership was sort of keyed off that, hey, this guy thinks it's okay to question what Victor Werwol says. And I did. And so, later down the road, I like point blank asked the minister we moved to Atlanta to work with. I asked him at one point blank, if I do the seminary training, do I have to hand my brain over to the way? And he said, absolutely not. And that was not a true statement at that time. They expected me to toe the party line. And but he didn't want to say that because he knew that would mean I was going to be done. But it just prolonged the inevitable in that case. And again, the way is trying to make some reforms. Maybe that's something that they'll get to someday. I don't know. But as of right now, I think a lot of doctrinal things are closed, including this John 1 question.
So when did you end up leaving the way formally?
So we got kicked out when I was I think 29, and then we still went to way fellowships on and off for the next 2 years, trying to like work our way out. There's my wife's parents were ministers at that point and high up in the way. My parents were heavily involved in the way for my entire life. My dad even long before that. And so that was a very difficult 2 years of trying to deal with essentially what amounted to a divorce in some sense. Yeah. And so there was sort of this period of time where we were in flux, and my brother at that time ran a way fellowship, and I attended his way fellowship, and basically he let me teach whatever I wanted to teach. And I knew more about the way's theological stances than anyone in that Bible study. So I knew where the way had a defined doctrinal statement, and I knew where the way didn't have a defined doctrinal statement. So I just taught a lot of interesting things over here. It's like I just taught a lot of stuff over here, and I never violated like what you would consider their statement of faith or things that they taught in public. I never did that because I have respect for organizations. And I think that they have the right to monitor and to some degree control what comes from the pulpit or Bible study chair. And so, but it was ended up being a good environment for us where I could still feel like I could contribute and teach and do things that I thought were interesting, but do it in the way framework. But eventually we essentially got run out. And that was when I started like publishing my book on God and Science. I started my website, Study Driven Faith, and I started being very open online about places where I disagreed with the way. And at that point, I knew the time was numbered. The days were numbered. Yeah,
well, I'm sure that wasn't easy, even though it might have felt freeing
Yeah.
especially with all of those family connections and ties and stuff like that. I'm sure that
Yeah.
was very difficult.
It was.
So when did you get in touch with Sean Finnegan?
So I actually met Sean very briefly at Converge. It's a funny story. I was at that point sort of I would call it a fanboy. I had been listening to Restitutio for about 6 months at that point. This was 2019.
Goodness gracious, our stories are so similar, because I had sort of dropped some of this theology stuff for a while.
I did too.
And was sort of like, man, that Trinity stuff is just nothing but problems in my life, right? And I'm just gonna fly under the radar. I'm married to my wife. She's from a Trinitarian background, but she knew full well before she married me my views, and we had kind of agreed to we were able to get along in that. And we were going to Trinitarian churches and stuff like that. So I'm just like, man, I have my thoughts, but I'm just going to be quiet. I don't want any trouble and stuff like that. And then I ended up getting, I volunteered for the worship band, which was, of course, a very risky thing to do, which ended up leading to me getting excommunicated from a Trinitarian church. And it brought up all of these questions again that I had sort of been ignoring since my time in college. And I'm like, oh, I guess I really do need to figure this out. This is never going to go away. And then I'm like going online, like in college, like the idea of going online to listen to podcasts or stuff about that was like too early for that. YouTube might have existed, but it was like too soon for any of those sorts of things. And so this time around, I'm like, man, there's all these podcasts. I'm like, oh, okay, Sean Finnegan. Okay, my dad knew Vince Finnegan from the Way. Okay, so that's a connection. And like all of these other things. And like, okay, so there's Anthony Buzzard, there's Dale Tuggy, and I'm like getting the lay of the landscape of this sort of online biblical Unitarian stuff. And then Converge happens. I'm like, Dad, I think we should go to Converge. So I'm not sure if I met you there, honestly.
There were a lot of people there. I don't remember meeting you then, but yeah.
And then I like played Frisbee with Sean Finnegan and like explained who I was and that sort of thing. And it was really exciting to meet him in person and meet Dale Tuggy and all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, anyway.
I went the same goals. I was like, I had come across Dale Tuggy and I was like, where has Dale Tuggy been all my life? I would have loved to have known about this stuff in college. And like you said, it was too soon. It was like before the Trinity podcast. It was before a lot of that stuff. In fact, Dale Tuggy, I think, didn't come to the BU position until I was like a freshman in college. So I guess we were probably going through the journey at the same time, although he's a little older than me. I won't say he's ancient because he might watch this. But anyway, he's a friend of mine now, and I think it's wonderful that I can call people like Dale Tuggy a friend. So I'm listening to Restitutio. I had questions about like dispensationalism coming from a hyper dispensationalist church in the Way, and there's funny stories I could tell about that and how I avoided the prompting of God to research that until I was ready. And oh man, it led to, and now I've got like one of my favorite series is on my website is about time periods in the Bible and how helping people understand the differences between dispensationalist and covenantalist viewpoints. But anyway, so I'm listening to Restitutio. My life is changing. My theology is changing. I'm really pressing in on a lot of things, on holiness and on, really following Jesus and on, putting the Gospels where they belong, which is not epistles up here and Gospels down here, but like, more, maybe even slightly like this, but, definitely in the same ballpark, no matter what. And
right, because in case probably most of the people this deep into the podcast know a fair amount about the Way International, but for those who don't, it was very dispensationalist. And me growing up, like we still had all of that hyper dispensationalist stuff too in my ex-Way fellowship, and sometimes that treats the Gospels as from a previous dispensation or a previous sort of working of God, where the main audience of the Gospels is the Jews in Jesus's context, and that we're part of we being Christians now are part of the church dispensation, which really begins at Pentecost. And so really the epistles are to us, and the Acts of the Apostles is about kind of that history. And so there's much more emphasis on the epistles of Paul and the stories in the book of Acts, then
Right.
the Gospels are interesting. It's not that they're completely irrelevant, but they're downgraded to a lower status of relevancy than the
Right.
epistles.
Yeah. The way put the Gospels in the Old Testament formally. I mean, they would say the Gospels are in Old Testament.
Yeah. And so you started to question some of those sorts of things. And
so
I'll just say my dad is like, chin deep in trying to work through covenantalism and the various and like progressive dispensationalism and all these things. And he emails with like Jerry Werewolf, and it was different than Victor Werewolf, just in case anyone, but they are related.
they are related. So I end up at Converge, and I'm going to meet I want to meet Dale Tuggy and Bill Schlegel and these people that I've started listening to and reading. And I wanted to meet Sean too, but I knew Sean was going to be busy because Jerry Werwell was running the event. Jerry's a good friend of mine. I knew Sean would be on staff. And so the only interaction I had with Sean at Converge was I'm getting lunch. I'm in the lunch line at the buffet at the college. And I see Sean come up with one of his sons, and I'm like, "Hi, Sean." And I had kids at this point, so I know he's doing dad stuff, and I shouldn't be talking to him, right? So I just go, "Hi, Sean. My name is Will Barlow. I'm a big fan of the podcast. I know you're busy. We can talk another time." And he's just like, "Oh, hi, Will." And that was the conversation,
And he probably had 10 other interactions like that lunch.
Oh yeah. So a little bit later, I don't know how the conversation came up, but like I said, Jerry Werwell is a good friend of mine. And at some point he told Sean, "Look, you should hear my buddy Will's testimony about how he got kicked out of the Way Corps, the Way Seminary program." And Sean agreed. And so he reached out to me via Facebook, and we arranged a time. And that was the first time I had a real conversation with Sean Finnegan, was that Rest Studio episode, which came out a couple of years ago. And so a couple of years ago,
I'll link that too.
Yeah. So that's my story about what happened to me and what led to us getting kicked out. So that conversation happens, and it's like, okay, now I know Sean. Then we were planning on going to family camp that summer, but COVID hit, and so family camp got canceled. Kingdom Fest was limited, and we decided not to go to Kingdom Fest that year. And so I really didn't talk to Sean for almost a year after that. We online a little bit here and there, interacted very briefly, but nothing big. And then he reached out because he was interested in interviewing me for my article series on giving in the church. And so that became a 3-part Restitutio series starting last year. And that was the second time I had really talked to Sean in any depth. And that was in the middle of the conversation where he asked me in between episodes, "Would you think about planting a church in Louisville?" That was the second major time I talked to Sean Finnegan, was he's dropping that kind of question.
I'll say, I know that Sean Finnegan can be a very persuasive person, and that he has high ambitions for lots of people. Yeah,
he does. So, but apparently, between his and all throughout the background, I think he's talking to Jerry, and I have, like I said, I'm very good friends with Jerry, have a long relationship with Jerry. So I'm sure Jerry was helping him understand a little bit more about me. But really, the last year has been a beautiful growth in our friendship, Sean and my friendship, and a deepening of my relationship with Jerry too. And we went to visit New York in May last year. We went to family camp. They invited me to teach, which was an honor because I'd never been to family camp before with Living Hope. So to teach my first time was a huge honor, very blessed. And then they invited me to teach at Kingdom Fest. And so my whole family came to Kingdom Fest, and we did that this last fall. And so then been in constant contact with them about the church plant and stuff like that as well. And so it's just been a wonderful developing of a friendship. And so now it's fun because there's that awkward conversation at Converge, which had zero promise. And now we've got this great friendship, and so it's wonderful. It's been great for our family to be plugged into that community and to have more support. It's been wonderful for us.
And so your church plant, it's not like you're part of the same denomination as Living Hope, but how exactly would you describe your connection to Living Hope?
I call it independent, but affiliated is sort of what I would
Uh-huh.
call it. Yeah. So everything about us is independent. We have an independent board, independent financials, independent everything. But they're the planting church. I mean, they're going to be providing a large part of our financial support for the first 3 years, and then we have to take it from there. So, yeah.
Cool. Cool. All right, let's talk a little bit about faith and science, and then we'll wrap this up. So you, speaking of your connection to Living Hope, you have a teaching series that you're doing on the Living Hope channel about faith and science.
Yes.
And so there are, I think you dropped your 4th episode last night,
Right.
and I can see that you have more queued up. So I can obviously tell from your story that this is something that you've thought a lot about. So what sort of inspired you to focus on this topic for a teaching series now?
Yeah. So yeah, Sean asked me a couple months ago. He was like, we need someone to teach our spring class, and I thought of you. He said, we want to do a remote teacher, and we want to get you to teach something. And he said, do you have anything that you could do sort of out of the box? And I gave him 2 options, and my first choice was scripture and science, which is what I'm doing. And really the background, it goes all the way back to when I was a kid, as a 10 and 12-year-old, asking my dad, how do we fit the scientific evidence with Genesis? How does this work? And the way has a gap understanding. And for your listeners who aren't immediately aware of what a gap is, what gap says is that Genesis 1:1 is the creation of the universe, which could be 13 billion years ago. There's no reason to argue with the science on that. Then something catastrophic happened between verses 1 and verse 2. And then verse 2, when it says, and the earth was without form and void, that word was should be translated became, and that God in the rest of the chapter is essentially reconstituting or reordering, or whatever you want to call it, the earth, and that could have happened 6,000 or 10,000 years ago, but that the whole universe could be old. The thing that's nice about the gap theory is that it points to the text. It points to the text of Genesis. It points to other texts, other views.
And the way isn't the only people that hold this view.
No, it was the most common evangelical view of Genesis 1 before young earth creationism came in vogue in the late 50s. So like it was very mainstream back in like the 40s and 50s. It was very mainstream. Now it's more of a minority position because young earth has held sway for so long. So anyway, so I grew up with gap. I grew up with an old earth kind of understanding. I go study physics. I see the evidence for the Big Bang. I think Big Bang points towards God. I think fine-tuning in physics and astronomy points towards God. I think this all helps. And so that led me to write a book called God and Science, which I published around the time we left the way, I think in late 2016. And I'm in the process of now revising that book. So if your listeners have made it this far, this podcast, if you buy the Kindle version, just know, hopefully a new version will show up in about 4 or 5 months. So I'm hoping to really expand it and really do a better job of portraying the different views instead of focus. I sort of limited my discussion to the gap understanding. And I think maybe later in the book, I sort of scope out like wide brushstrokes, how the other views would work. But I'm going to add a lot to the actual book in the next couple of months. But yeah, so basically what the class is about is I start with why do we believe what we believe, and I present the idea that the best worldview is the one that explains the most evidence. And then we go to Genesis 1, and we spend a lot of time in Genesis 1 talking about who is the original audience of Genesis 1, how would they have come to the text, what questions were they asking, because they're different from the questions that we ask about the text. They wouldn't have thought about pre-human humans and the Big Bang and the Cambrian explosion and all that stuff. They're not thinking about any of that stuff. They're thinking, are we going to survive in this wilderness? Is this God who led us out of Egypt still here helping us? And so anyway, when we approach the text that way, I think that gives us a better perspective. But anyway, I present 8 different views on Genesis 1, pros and cons for all of them. And then I relate the 3 major scientific disciplines, physics and astronomy, biology, chemistry, and evolution, and then geology and earth science in relationship to Noah's flood. And that sort of sketches out a lot of the rest of the class. And then we're going to end with a little bit on miracles. And then the last session will be about how do we deal with science in the Bible? How do we handle things that are bad, things that are old science, like flat earth and stuff like that? And how do we do stuff that's good, like medical stuff about quarantine way before its time? What should we expect from an ancient Near East text as it relates to modern science? And what I'm essentially going to sketch out is that what we see is what we should expect to see, and with some pretty cool improvements on what we would expect to see, that I think lends to the inspiration of Scripture.
Interesting. Yeah, because some of those questions are kind of similar to what we talked about earlier with the Eucharist and parking lots. So okay, so these people lived in a different world than us. What's the essential thing that needs to stay the same between us? And what are these sort of relevant contextual things that we can understand was their context that make them the way they are, and therefore, because we're in a different context, they're different. Okay, so we don't think that the heavens are a dome anymore. They seem to have thought that the heavens are a dome, and virtually all the church fathers thought that the world was round and that there was 7 layers of heaven, which corresponded to the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets, and that highest heaven was the thing that was outside all of the circles. It's like, okay, so that's an interesting thing. And that actually, when Paul says he was raised to 3rd heaven and, that sort of thing, I think that there's some evidence that the New Testament authors had that same thing as the church fathers. It's like, okay, I don't believe in a geocentric universe with these 7 kind of they're like one-way mirrors, right? Like if you're in a higher layer of heaven, you can see down to the lower ones. But if you're in the lower layers, you can't see up through the other ones, which is why we have like this spherical ball, right? Where we can't see up into heaven, but heaven can see us, right? And so it's like, that doesn't really work, anymore. So how do we bridge those sorts of differences in understanding? It's a question I still kind of wrestle with, honestly.
Yeah, John Walton, in his book Lost World of Genesis 1, he makes several really important insights, and I think his first 2 propositions are very helpful. And one of the things that he says there's no reason why God should pick any particular time science over another's in terms of revealing Scripture. And so you think about what I explain in the class I'm currently teaching, is science is fluid, that over time, our view of science has changed. And that even right now, with current evolutionary theory, current Big Bang theory, there are open problems that scientists will tell you, hey, in evolution, there's an open problem. We cannot explain the Cambrian explosion. We cannot explain this. And so there are all these open problems, even in generally accepted scientific theories. And essentially, from a historical perspective, every single scientific theory that's come before us has been wrong to one degree or another. Now, I think that there's a limit to that skepticism because, for example, GPSs use Einstein's theory of relativity. So, to some degree, relativity is true. To some degree, Newtonian mechanics is true. We can talk of it like that. But there are things that they're always refining scientifically. And so what Walton is saying is that if science is fluid throughout time, if it's always progressing, always getting more and more knowledge and better, and theories are rising and falling over time, why would God pick the science of 1000 AD? Why would he pick the science of 2022? Why would he pick the science of 3 BC or whatever? He's going to pick the science of the people who were the original audience, which, as far as we know, was the people that were wandering around in the wilderness with Moses. And so that's why you get the dome. That's why you get the earth coming out of water. That's why you get all these other things that we observe in Genesis 1.
And the foundations of the earth, right? That isn't just a metaphor for them. That isn't just flowery poetic language.
Right.
They thought that the earth was on a foundation somewhere.
Right. Sure. Yeah. So that's I think very helpful in terms of looking back at the text and saying, let's primarily focus on the questions they would have asked. So I'm increasingly, even though I'm big into science, and I think that there's some interesting connections you can draw between Genesis 1 and the Big Bang model or other models of how the earth came to be. I am more and more comfortable with a non-literal kind of a view and just saying, Big Bang, evolution, like these are not ancient problems, these are modern problems.
Right. And one thing that's also interesting is that when you read the church fathers, they're way more inclined towards allegorical spiritual interpretations of the first couple chapters of Genesis. I'm not saying that they believed in like a billion-year-old universe and the theory of evolution,
Right.
But when they approach Genesis, they're like talking about much more about symbolism and allegory and like spiritual theological truth and trying to get those sorts of things out of it. Although there are some church fathers that try and calculate the date of creation and how long ago it was and use the genealogies, and they come up with like, you know, what we would say it was 4,000 years ago for them, but it was 6,000 years ago for us, right? And that sort of thing. So you can and then like it's Theophilus of Antioch, I remember reading, he calculates the dates of all these things. And then he goes and then he interprets Genesis allegorically. So it's like for him, he was like, yeah, okay, you know, literal, allegorical too, and it's that sort of that same two-track thing that we were talking about earlier with John. So one thing I have to ask you, and I should go in just a couple minutes here, but and this is because your lectures on Genesis 3 and creation and human origins haven't come out yet, but where do you lean in terms of human origins and evolution and special creation of humans, biological relations to chimpanzees, etc.?
Yeah, so I would say right now, and you know, I'm open on this subject. One of the things I explained in the class is that I come from a background of physics, so I feel very strongly about old Earth because of what I've seen in the evidence for physics, from physics and astronomy. And so I like Big Bang. I think it points towards God. And if you look at the old Earth creationist literature, a lot of them are in the same camp as me. Like Hugh Ross thinks the same way, Gerald Schroeder thinks the same way, the Gap guys will think the same way. Everyone seems to like the Big Bang and the evidence from physics and astronomy. No one likes evolution from those camps. You know, you have like Francis Collins and the Biologos guys, they're on in like an island by themselves. And in fact, there have been apologetic books that have come out recently sort of criticizing theistic evolution and Francis Collins's perspective.
Stephen Meyer has been sort of a new voice in that. Jonathan
Wells. And there's been others over the years. I would say that as a physicist, looking at the observations we can make about physics and astronomy, I would put them as on a higher plane than what I think of as the evidence for evolution. I think the strongest evidence for evolution it does not come from the fossil record. It does not come from some of these morphological ways of looking at animals and things like that. I think the strongest evidence for evolution comes from the genetics. It's a harder science. It's easier to demonstrate.
It's more quantitative and easier to make sort of statistical determinations about, in a certain sense.
Absolutely. But I don't have the background that you have, having studied more evolution more formally. So I admit in the class, I admit my bias that I'm a physicist, a former physicist, studying this stuff as an outsider, and I don't have any connection really to the evidence on any emotional level. And whether we want to admit it or not, we're not 100% rational beings. There's an emotional attachment that we make to evidence and to truth claims and all those things. And so my bias is against evolution. My bias is against that evidence. And my bias is for like Big Bang and for like the physical evidence from physics and astronomy. So I would say where I land right now is, with all those caveats in place, is I believe the special creation of humans right now. That's where I land. I think there was a historical Adam and Eve. I don't necessarily think that you have to have a specific view of Genesis to get there, Genesis 1 to get there. But yeah, that's where I end up right now. Is I would say I believe in the special creation of Adam and Eve. I think that God could have very well used a lot of the same building blocks that he used for pre-human humans. And that we would look very similar to them in a lot of ways genetically. I don't know how you explain all the junk DNA issues that Francis Collins brings up that seem to fit evolutionary theory more, other than to say that maybe that happened after sin entered in the world. Maybe that's where the deletions and the changes in the genetic code, because we can't go back in time and like genetically test like Adam and Eve. Like if we could do that, maybe we could have a better case for special creation, or maybe we would have theistic, we'd have proof for theistic evolution. I don't know. We don't have a time machine to go back into time and do that. But that's where I land right now. I'm curious, since you studied more of evolutionary theory, where you are on it.
I mean, like I said earlier, I had something of a crisis of faith on this, and I would say I am a theistic evolutionist that takes a more allegorical reading of the Adam and Eve stories. I am somewhat agnostic on whether or not Adam and Eve are even historical at all, or just purely kind of allegory and typology at the level of something like a true parable or something like that. Not saying that it's not true, like it can be true in a different way than a literal truth. Yeah,
absolutely.
And honestly, I've had a lot of conversations recently, like on my channel. One of my favorite conversations partners is John Vervaeke, and he's a former Christian, and he's a cognitive scientist and philosopher at the University of Toronto. He's an intimidatingly smart guy. And a lot of our video conversations have been about evolution and how that connects with Platonic philosophy, and me sort of not just saying that Christianity and evolution are compatible, but that to really solve some of the problems of evolution, that you need something like Christianity, and making an evolutionary argument for Christianity, not just an argument of their compatibility, but if you believe evolution, then you should be a Christian. And so but I hold an open mind on these subjects too. And I remember my pre-evolutionary self, and he wasn't wrong about everything either. So I like your approach that, we don't need to be certain on all of these things. And there's almost an exciting prospect for personal growth to not be certain, or to not think that you have all the answers, because it gives us something to do and talk about and think about and learn about. So, that's where I am right now. So, but I appreciate your openness. I should get going in just a minute or two. Do you want to have any? You could react to that, and then do you want to have any closing remarks?
I'll just say one thing that might blow whoever is still paying attention to this or still watching this. Well, let's blow your mind one more time. I don't think we can read Genesis 1:1. We can read Genesis 1:1 in a way that's faithful to the original audience of Genesis 1:1, and doesn't have to be talking about the creation of the universe. It can be talking about the creation of the land and of the sky. And so even if you're a younger creationist, according to the text, I still think you have to interact with the scientific material. But even if we came up with scientific evidence for like a steady state or eternal universe, I don't think that blows up Christianity. I think you can read Genesis 1:1 in a way that doesn't even talk about the origins of the universe necessarily. And so I think there are so many ways of approaching this text. I'm not going to say that Genesis 1 is like completely scientifically non-falsifiable or something like that. I think there are predictions that get made in the Bible that can be addressed by science, and I don't believe in NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, like Stephen Jay Gould does. But I'm just saying that I don't think that evolution cripples the faith for anyone, or a non-literal view of Adam and Eve cripples the faith for anyone. I don't think that even if they came out with a steady state view of the universe or an eternal view of the universe, that blows up Genesis 1:1. So I think there are ways we can read the text that are faithful to the text and can handle that kind of a barrage.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Will. I'll put the links and your sort of all the things that I said I would link. I'll put that in the description. I'm extremely excited about the work that you're doing with your church plant. I think it gives me a lot of hope. Sometimes the church landscape can be just a very discouraging thing to try and interact with as a biblical Unitarian. But I'm excited by I feel like there's a new energy among our generation, like we talked about, kind of going to Converge and finding all of these people on the internet and stuff like that, that I think will have more manifestations in the real world too. And I think that you're a spot of hope and an example of that I can point to right now. So thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thanks for having me, Sam, and thanks for those kind words. Let's hope that we can put in the work with God's grace and mercy, and keep providing a beacon of hope for the people here in Louisville and around the world.
Well, great. I think that's a good place to end.